Welcome to my brand new show, Multitudes. It's an extension of my site where I highlight ideas and people that are worth exploring further. This first episode is a perfect encapsulation of that goal. It features a conversation with Yaroslav Shipilov, who is one of the 4 people behind PlasticList. PlasticList is a project that set out to determine just how much plastic might be in the foods that we're consuming in the Bay Area, and the results were staggering. 86% of the foods tested contained plastic. This conversation is unique because not only do we talk about the results of those tests that were just released a week ago, but we also talk about what it's like to go and pursue an ambitious and unusual project like PlasticList. I think you'll learn a lot from it. So without further ado, enjoy the conversation with Yaroslav.
Yeah, in one sentence, PlasticList is a database of plastic chemicals in Bay Area foods.
Mm-hmm. And what was sort of the thing that actually caused this to get started?
The point at which I enter, which I think is kind of a good point for the start of PlasticList, is Nat's post on X about rerunning the tests that he saw. He saw another company or another organization run the tests before, and he thought, wouldn't it be great to run the same thing but for Bay Area foods and maybe for even more foods than they have done it. So the things that got all of us collectively interested in doing this were just the research that was coming out about, on the one hand, the idea that maybe we're all eating more plastic chemicals, I should say, than any other generation before. That specifically captured me and my interest, was the idea that maybe no one had ever eaten this many plastic chemicals before, and therefore we've not ever seen anything that was on the scale of what we have today. And so that seems like a big idea to explore, at least.
And there was sort of this question of, are we even eating as many plastic chemicals as maybe some people think we're doing?
Yeah.
And then if that's true, then we have to sort of think about what could that actually mean. But before you can even start to think about the potential ramifications, if there are any, you have to start by asking, is it even happening, right?
Indeed. And it's like a chicken and egg, right? If we don't have the chemicals, maybe we shouldn't even spend time on researching the alleged harms. If we don't have the harms, maybe we shouldn't spend time on figuring out if there are chemicals. And if we do, then the other part becomes important. We decided to start with the testing of the foods because we could do it more precisely and faster. And this just seemed like the right first project to start, to then figure out if caring about the health effects was important.
So I think everybody who hears about a really cool project, one that it's just not, your standard startup or something like that, or not your standard nonprofit even, they hear about it and they say, well, how did that come to be? How did he get involved with that, right? Yeah. And I think that it's really illustrative for you to maybe share that. Like, how did you get involved? What was the process there? Because it's probably not as complex as many people might make it out to be, but what was it?
Yeah. I spammed Nat with messages, but really the thing I did was, at some point I was in the kitchen just cutting my lunch, and then I had this idea of, wouldn't it be cool to build the interface for the research that Nat was going to do. He had just tweeted about it. I saw it. I thought it was great. And so I sat down after lunch and I just built the first version of PlasticList, came up with a name in 0.2 seconds, thought PlasticList sounded cool. Build a website, and the first version of the website was just you basically had a little preamble that said, we might be all eating plastics. It is possible that plastic chemicals that are added to plastics are harmful. And so Nat Friedman is running these tests. This is going to be the UI for these tests. We're not affiliated with Nat Friedman. If you know him, please show him this, and he can reach out to us.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have a way to get to Nat at the time directly. So I just shared that. I posted about that on X. That got some views, but not really a response from anyone. I emailed that to Nat as well. Mm-hmm. Didn't get any response. And then I basically told myself I was going to work on this for a week and make it better, make a V2 that was better than the initial website. And then if Nat saw it, or if there was some interest in that I would continue. If not, I would just have that as an artifact, and whenever the results come in, I would just put them up there and have that as a publicly accessible good. And so I spent exactly a week just building a better version of the website. I could only build one thing really well, so I decided to build voting, because it seemed cool that people could go on the website and submit the votes for the foods that they were interested in.
The ones
I did
you
that.
wanted to have tested.
Yeah. It felt like a cool addition to like, I just basically thought, what can I make that's useful and like feature complete in a couple of days. And so voting seemed like a good one. So I built a voting website and launched that again. And 20 minutes later, I got a DM from Nat. Like, yo, what are you doing? Do you want to work on this? And at the time, we thought, both Nat and I and everyone involved thought it was going to take just a couple of weeks to do this. And so we just had a quick call, and he asked me about my interest in spending maybe a couple of weeks working on this. And I said, sure, a couple of weeks I'll definitely spend on this, and let's test it. Let's put it all on the website. It ended up taking 6 months, but neither of us knew it back then. So that's how I got involved.
So, maybe rewind back a little bit to this, just to sort of analyze it for people who are listening or watching. There's this aspect of you hear about something that's cool. You say, how can I get involved? And instead of like waiting around for somebody to tell you how to get involved, you just put something together and threw it up there to see what people would react to it, how they would think about it. I think it's really cool.
Yeah. You can. It's very easy to make something. To make something in general, right? You use, like, I think I just put it up on Vercel. It was great. Making something useful was a little harder, but you just kind of think about, especially when you have a constraint, it's really good.
What got you really excited about going from sort of like, you put that first thing out there, didn't get a ton of interest from anybody, and then like saying, I want to spend more time on this. Was there just this interest in, like, you started to think about this plastic in the things that you eat, and that just got you curious and wanting to spend more time, or was there something else?
I saw a graph that showed the amount of research, the amount of studies done on the harms of phthalates and bisphenols, and it was just an up and to the right. It was mapping the number of studies, and on the x-axis was time. And you could basically see that we're living in a time when we have this like unprecedented amount of data about this. And so before I could even read all of that, I thought, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe it's actually unprecedented, in which case we should try and solve this. And I think that the aspect of like the future is different from the past, and we might be in this uncharted territory with plastic chemicals got me interested.
It's really cool. And you said that when you got on this call, it wasn't just the two of you, there were a bunch of other people sort of who were coalescing around this as well. Did they all sort of independently reach out to Nat, or what was sort of, how was this team sort of assembling?
Yeah, the initial team was 4 people, which was much larger than what Nat expected. And we all thought it was a very, very quick, simple
straightforward thing.
Yeah. But I think we got, I built the website. One other person, I think, got connected through X as well. Mm-hmm. So a bunch of people just said, hey, she's great. And then Nat looked at her. So if you have a bunch of friends who can basically vouch for you and just spam someone famous with comments and saying, you're great, you should definitely do that. It works sometimes. And the other 2 people, I think Nat shared a Google form, which I wasn't even aware of. Yeah. And so I think those 2 people applied to the Google form.
And how did you all, so there's 4 of you working on this sort of initially. How did you all sort of split up sort of roles and responsibilities, things you were working on?
We would have, we all roughly just try to push in the same direction. Mm-hmm. We would have these surges. The first surge was, let's find the lab. Turned out to be harder than we thought, mostly because we wanted to find a really, really good lab. And either we would basically realize the lab is not as good as we wanted, or the lab would decline working with us.
And you reached out to about 100 of them, right?
Over 100, yeah.
Over 100.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Spoke to a lot of labs.
What was the thing that caused you to realize the lab that you went with was the lab for you?
So we had, at some point in the project, and maybe in a couple of weeks after start, we got a very, very excellent chemist, analytical chemist, who agreed to advise us and help us vet the lab. So once we would find the lab, we would basically set up a call where he would talk to them, ask them all sorts of technical questions that we didn't understand back then. And he actually, there were a lot of labs that we thought at first glance were good. Then he would talk to them. He'd say, no, I'm not going to endorse this project if you go with that lab because X, Y, Z reasons. And so we'd say, okay, no, not that lab. And then we'd keep going. And then once we found the right lab, one, our chemist was very happy with them, and 2, it was just a difference in communication. They were much more just kind of ready to do things. So they had all the experience that we needed, whereas we would talk to other labs and would tell them, hey, we want to test 100 different foods. That's actually a relatively hard problem because different foods require different methodologies for testing because of the different matrices, different types of products. Some of them are more fatty, some of them have sugars. And so most of the other labs would tell us, oh, that's really hard. We have to develop all these methodologies and it will take 6 months and we'll charge you a lot of money and maybe we won't be able to do it. And this lab just said, yeah, we'll do it. And we're confident we can do it correctly. We've done this before. It will take, a few weeks. And then they named the price that was lower than what the other labs were saying. So on every account, they were just better than everyone else. And we thought, great. And then we decided to work with them.
So that was the first sort of sprint, finding that lab.
Yeah.
What was the next push?
The next push was shipping the samples to the lab. I've never done this much shopping in my entire life. We would just essentially shop day in and day out. And we do it in a way that simultaneously was on the one hand, we try to standardize things, to not introduce random weird contamination. But on the other hand, we still wanted it to feel realistic. No one goes in gloves to the store and picks stuff, right? So we just kind of tried to keep it natural, but the same so that you could compare the results. And that was interesting. We got to shop a lot. We went to all the stores around the Bay Area. So pretty much every food that you see on the website was either bought in the Bay Area or it was, some of them are purchased online from the Bay Area.
Maybe you could actually, here, I'll hand you the computer. Maybe you can scroll through and talk about some of the things.
Sure thing. So the foods were a mix of just the things we ourselves ate and the voting that I told you about. We actually got 7,000 votes for hundreds of foods. So we used that heavily to prioritize the things that we wanted to test. And then others were requests people sent us that people were interested. For example, one person asked us to test the pump that their baby was born prematurely. And the baby was being fed through this pump. And the pump looked like it was made from plastic. And so the person asked us to run a few tests on that. So what we did was, and you see here at the top, we ran distilled water through it. And let's see if it has any chemicals. It looks like it doesn't, right? Yeah. So all of the gray numbers are non-detects, essentially.
Yeah.
And so it looks like it didn't. And then if you search for the formula that was running through the tubes, it looks like there are some detections here. And this could have come either through so for example, in this case, we tested the formula by itself, and then here through the pump. So then you can go and you could run follow-on studies to figure out if it's the formula or if it's the pump. It could be the pump too, because the formula is fattier, and fattier foods are more likely to pull out these chemicals, specifically phthalates, from packaging and other things. So that was one. There was this other category of foods. My personal favorite was we found a bunch of very, very old foods, like 100 years old, and mostly on eBay. And we'd order them from eBay. And the all-time favorite for me was the Ghirardelli. We found a Ghirardelli can of hot chocolate from the 1940s. So it's about 80 years old. And it turns out that Ghirardelli still makes hot chocolate. So it's roughly the same product from the same company. And we tested the old one and compared that to the new one. And that was really cool. So that's another group of samples that I thought was really.
And what did you see between those two? Because I think that what a lot of people say is, oh, we didn't have as much plastic in the food as we do now, right?
Yeah.
That was sort of the belief that people have. But I seem to recall that when I was looking at this, there was some pretty surprising things in the results here.
There totally were. One of the most surprising things for me was actually comparing these old foods with the modern ones. So Ghirardelli is pretty representative because it's the same product. Here we have a graph. The light gray is the old sample, and then the dark gray is the new one. We basically found that these old foods actually had chemicals too. And sometimes they had very large amounts of chemicals. But if you look at which chemicals were in there, that breakdown is different. The earlier foods, the older foods, had the more phthalates. So the original phthalates, which are chemicals that you add to plastics to make them more flexible, less brittle. Whereas the modern foods had more phthalate substitutes. Phthalate substitutes is this kind of separate class of compounds that were developed largely actually as a response to phthalates. And I think in the 70s was like when they were started being developed. In the 90s they were commercialized. And you kind of read about that. You go on the website and it says, these chemicals have been replaced. But what was really cool is you can actually just go and test something and you're like, oh yeah, the old thing had phthalates and the new thing has phthalate substitutes. It was surprising for me because at least from our reading that we've done, we found much more evidence that phthalates themselves are harmful and that they affect, in these animal studies that would affect these animals in terrible ways. But we didn't really find strong evidence for phthalate substitutes, which either we didn't do all the reading, or it could mean that maybe they are actually a safer alternative, because that's what they were initially meant to be, as kind of a substitute for phthalates. So the takeaway was that old foods also had chemicals, and they had more phthalates in a lot of cases, but fewer phthalate substitutes.
Now, maybe we can step back and talk about a couple of things that, if you haven't gone to PlasticList's before, might be interesting or useful. So yeah. I think that there's the first thing is, what were sort of the high level results of this experiment in terms of plastic content, things like that?
We found plastic chemicals in 86% of foods that we tested. So almost everywhere.
It's incredible.
And that was the main question that we're trying to answer. Are these foods around us? The answer is yes, they are. They're almost in everything we eat or drink or consume in other ways. And that's just one channel of ingestion. You also have them in the air, so they get into your skin. You have them on the personal care products that you use. And there's many other ways. And so many other ways other than food.
Sure.
So that was the biggest finding. The surprising finding was that because they're so widespread, they're also in a lot of the products that we thought was healthy. And the ones that maybe cost more, the ones that are organic. We tested, I think, close to 20, maybe over 20 organic products. And I think either all of them or all but one had some of these chemicals in at least one of the samples. So that was a big finding for us. The other one was just looking at the safety limits. The first question we asked ourselves after looking at how chemicals are everywhere was, well, how bad is this? The second part of the chicken and egg problem was, how bad is this? And we didn't do any studies ourselves, but we went to the official food safety agencies, environmental safety agencies.
And there are a whole bunch, and maybe you could say sort of the names of those, the different acronyms here.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch. The ones we looked at were the FDA in the United States, the EPA, which is not focusing just on food, but kind of general environmental protection, and the EFSA, which stands for the European Food Safety Authority, I think, in the European Union. So we looked at those three primarily. But there are many more, and they all have different regulations for these chemicals. So what we found was that it was just really confusing and hard to figure out. If you're a consumer, say you go on PlasticList, you see that your favorite product has something, and then you try to figure out, is that bad for me?
Yeah.
Depending on who you go to, they will either tell you that it's really bad or that it's fine, you shouldn't worry. And so, for example, we'd see DIBP is one of the chemicals. It was banned in the toys that children would play with, but it was not banned in the foods. So you essentially have a situation where kids could they couldn't have the chemical in the toys that they touch, but it's okay if that chemical was in the food that they would eat. And it's because two different agencies, would be overseeing those things.
And there's also something that I read in your report about how sometimes the beliefs around this within these agencies change too, right? There's a change in terms of what they believe the levels are that might be concerning, right?
Sometimes these agencies change. They do these kinds of reviews where they review the evidence and they say, based on the new evidence, here's what we think now. And the most recent one was by the European agency, where they lowered their safety limit for BPA. But when we saw the magnitude of that change, that was also jaw-dropping. I think they dropped it by 20,000 X.
Yeah.
So you would have some amount, and now it's 20,000 times lower. What that resulted in is then you go to the then you go to the US agency, and it says, no, it's actually that one of the older limits is okay. It didn't have to be updated, but the European Union says that it did, the EFSA. And the difference between the European and the American standards were 250,000 times. So
Was the European standard stricter?
the European standard was stricter.
Yeah.
And so if you look at most of the results that exceeded the BPA limits, like the infamous boba one that people seem to react to a lot, if you ask the American regulators, they'll actually say it's fine. It's safe. And it wasn't clear to us at first glance, and after a little bit of reading, that there was this one authority that we should go to, and we should just look at them. We didn't really feel that. We felt like different agencies actually had different good points. So it made it really hard to analyze something like the BPA results that we got. And
now, I think a really interesting thing would be to understand perhaps what these levels are of equivalent foods in Europe, for instance, because maybe there's some aspect here where these levels are within range of what's acceptable according to these agencies in the United States. But then you go to Europe and maybe they actually are different levels. Do you think that that's possible just because the supply chain is so different?
Yeah, we were really curious about that too. We actually have we made a table of previous studies that were done. Some of them were from Europe too. And there were chemicals found in European countries as well. Roughly, it's kind of not a one-to-one comparison there because different papers report different findings differently. But we have that data set out there. If somebody wants to go and do a one-to-one comparison where they do a more similar testing, where they run similar products, that would be really, really interesting. We have that as one of the ideas on the DIY page. It should be very doable on a much smaller budget than we have. So if somebody is listening to this in Europe and they want to do this, please do that. And there we even have some instructions on the side of, if you want to use an American lab, that actually might be possible. There's just some things you need to do to transport things. But otherwise, just go there and do that. And we would love to see the results.
You heard it. Make sure to reach out to him if you're looking at doing this, because I think it would be really great to have that comparative data. I'd love to hear a little bit more about just the sample gathering, sort of how you decided to do this in terms of these various scenarios in which you sort of maybe place the food, right? So there were some times when you had food in delivery containers or you took it directly from the restaurant. And I think you also did some experiments where you left water out in the heat in a car or something like that. Maybe you could speak a little bit to these various types of tests, kind of what you were trying to get at with those and sort of what you learned from them.
Yeah, there was just the things that we were worried about, essentially. So leaving the water bottles in the car, I gave my car to a friend a couple months ago, and he went on this road trip, and he gave it back to me with I think 40 water bottles in the back seat, and were just great water bottles. It was wonderful. But then I was hesitant to drink it because it had spent maybe a day in the car, and I was thinking, I'm not sure if that something leached into it, and I would love to not be limited by that. Like maybe that's actually okay, and maybe actually I could drink that water. And so we just wanted to run those tests and see if we would see any difference or not. And specifically with the water in car test, we didn't actually see any difference. And so we didn't see any difference, but we also, I think one of the maybe reasons why, so we don't know why that is, right? We stuck the water in the car for an hour on a hot day in Palo Alto, and the car was in the sun. We measured the temperature. The temperature went up, so the water bottle is definitely heated. But the chemicals were essentially non-detected in either the unheated bottle or the heated bottle. So, we kind of expected to maybe see the unheated bottles would have no detections, but then the heated bottles would have a bunch. That's not what we saw. We saw 0 detections anywhere. And what that means is that it might actually be useful as a tip for reading this data is when you see something that's gray on that website, you should treat it as it's somewhere between 0 and whatever that gray number is. So if it's below 3,000, it's either 0 or 1,000 or somewhere up to 3,000. And that's because of the way that chemical analysis works. A lot of these chemicals are so present in the environment that there's going to be natural variation. So the lab always sets a limit of quantification. And they say if it's below that limit, we just can't tell you if that's actually the case or if it's just natural variation. If it's above this limit, we can confidently tell you that there's actually chemicals here. And so it's possible that they're just somewhere there. There's some of these limits. Maybe the amount of chemicals went up, but it all stayed below that limit. But we just don't know.
And what happened with the takeout food? Because I think this is another one. So the takeout food, everybody gets these big plastic containers. I think that there's, assuming this is an assumption that needs to be, tested really. This idea that like this stuff leaching into you and you actually eating these plastics is bad for you. But I think that people are like, oh, well, wouldn't this hot food in this plastic container that looks fairly cheaply constructed, wouldn't that be bad for me? Or wouldn't that be leaching into my food? And what did you find from that compared to the food that came straight from the restaurant? And what was that test like?
We found that it does leach. We tested on 3 different days.
Can you pull that up, by the way?
Yeah.
That would be great.
We ordered Indian food. And we collected the sample, one of the samples straight from the restaurant. So the one on the left here is straight from the restaurant. And you can see the little dot. We're measuring the temperature with the temperature gun. And the other one was in this container that is very popular. I have a lot of them at home. And then... Do you save yours, by the way? Do you save the restaurant containers sometimes? I do. I mean,
reuse them?
I feel like it's very useful, and I have a lot of them at home. So I was actually very interested. When I saw that container, I was like, that's exactly what I have at home. That's great. Let's test this. And so what we found was that all in all, you have the totals here. The amount of chemicals in the takeout containers was 34% higher than for the foods that were collected straight from the restaurant. They had higher phthalates, but the biggest difference was in the phthalate substitutes. So they had about 40% higher substitutes and then 15% higher phthalates. And then they had, we actually saw more bisphenols in foods that were straight from the restaurant, but it seems like the levels are really low here.
And maybe you could share a little bit more about these chemicals of concern, because I think that that's an area that you've talked about different ones, but maybe we could just really briefly touch on these different types and sort of what they mean. Some of them are more, I have some notes in front of me around making plastics more flexible or more rigid, but maybe you could just do that quickly for anybody who's listening or watching to be able to like sort of get that quick sort of lesson on it.
There are tens of thousands of chemicals. And in the very beginning of the project, we had to decide which ones to test for. We talked to a bunch of people, and our 2 criteria were essentially, let's test for something that we think might actually be in the food. We have some reasons to suspect that. And let's test for something that there are at least some studies that show that maybe it's bad. We ended up testing for 18 chemicals. We tested for phthalates. The majority of the chemicals we tested for were phthalates. Phthalates are these very useful chemicals that are used as plasticizers, which means they're added to plastics to make them, plastic, right? To make them bend, to make them less brittle. And they've been used for about 100 years now. About 100 years ago, they started being introduced and popularized maybe about 80 years ago. We also tested for bisphenols, which is an older group of chemicals that were developed in the 19th century. And they are, they're not plasticizers. So instead, they're actually added to harden the plastics, as far as I know. And very widespread. I think we use on the order of, like millions of tons, I think, of these chemicals in the world. And we thought it would be interesting to test that, especially because a lot of the foods have BPA free on them. So we thought, wouldn't it be funny if we tested this for BPA and then like, what would we find, right? It wouldn't really be funny if we found the BPA, but we decided to test that. And then the third one was phthalate substitutes. And as I told you before, those are the substitutes that were developed to replace phthalates in production materials.
And why were they initially developed? What was the thing that caused that to happen?
Yeah. So my understanding is that they were actually developed with the purpose of replacing phthalates because of some of the concerns that people were having with the phthalates. There were studies that were coming out as far back as the 50s. So the EPA actually, when they set these limits for these chemicals, some of the studies they referenced were like 1959 or something. So there were some pretty old studies for today that would give these phthalates to rats, mostly, sometimes mice, and then see what happens, and bad things would happen. So people are interested in replacing them. There might be some other reason, but that's kind of the one that I've seen. And in 75, I think 1975 is when the phthalate substitute that was by far the most popular in Bay Area foods, DHT, was first synthesized by this company that started producing it under this other brand. They didn't call it DHT, they called it something else. But ever since, it's basically been used, and some of the highest levels of chemicals that we found in any of the foods in the Bay Area were for DHT. So they got pretty popular over the past 50 years.
And it's funny because in some ways, sometimes awareness is the lack of something. So, for instance, I think that most people became aware of BPA and sort of plastic leaching into things through Nalgene bottles, which were marketed as BPA free. What do you think, or what have you heard as you've been doing this? Are people sort of, do you think people will become aware of plastics in their foods or become more concerned about it the more that people start to advertise as, maybe they have a reduction of plastic or they have some cleaner processing or something like that? Like, how do you think that this might actually impact the way people view plastics in their lives?
Yeah, well, growing up, most of the things I know of that are bad is because you would see that some foods would say, we don't have that.
Yeah, no pesticides.
And they say, oh, that's probably bad. That's why you say it's not there. Which also isn't always true, by the way. Sometimes they're using pretty harmless things and they're saying it's not there. It's like, well, it wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. So that definitely happens. We've heard a lot of people just basically say that they've been following this for a while. That was surprising to me. I am relatively new to the problem of having plastic chemicals, or the perceived problem, depending on what you believe. There were a lot of people that I spoke with who seem to have been following this for years. It was very surprising for me. And people who have tried to minimize their exposure as well, by doing things like not microwaving foods in plastics, for example, which, by the way, all the foods that we tested before and after microwave, the post-microwave samples had fewer levels of these chemicals. And
that's fascinating. Can you pull that up and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
So I think almost everyone would guess that would not be the case. They would think that you microwave something. Clearly, you're heating things up. You're heating the plastic up. The heated plastic should somehow, fuse with the food in some way. What's going on there?
Yeah. So you can see here, I searched for microwave, and for example, this burrito here, before microwave, it had levels such as almost 9,000 nanograms per serving of DHP. And you can click here on DHP and you can read about it. It's a colorless liquid that sometimes is used as a solvent in glow sticks. And it's been around for almost 100 years. And there's a lot of studies that say it's bad, mostly in large quantities. And so the FDA asked pharma manufacturers to not use it. And they set a limit for drinking water. The EPA set limits. So you can kind of read about this.
Sure.
And so we can see that there's just more of it in this sample than in any of the samples that we tested after the microwave.
Now, these are the exact same burrito. It's not like two different burritos of the same brand. This is the same burrito that was before the microwave, and then you microwaved it and you tested the same burrito afterwards?
So the important part here is we didn't want to take the foods out of the package that were packaged.
Got it.
Right, because then we would risk introducing something to them. So what we'd usually do is we try and buy just comparable products. Sometimes we go to the same store, or we look at the lot number. We try to find the same expiration date. So basically keep them as close to each other as possible, and then separate them. So they're two separate burritos, just because we didn't want to open the package. And but they're the same exact sort of burrito that you would go to a store and buy.
And the assumption is that the variability probably isn't that wide from burrito to burrito. It's more that this is due to introducing the microwave.
That was the assumption.
Yeah.
After we tested all the data, we actually had this nice data set, so we could go and look at the difference between the two samples of the same product. We found, at least higher than what I expected, the variability between two samples of the same product. You go to the store, you buy this twice, was, I think, on average in the like 60-something%, maybe 60% or so. So that's kind of higher than what you think.
Yeah.
Right? It's still not the 8,600 to 2,000. That's still, probably outside of the variability. But it's still larger than I thought.
So you're holding up a LaCroix. Maybe type that in. What do we have for that? This is the Bay Area, the most popular drink in the Bay Area.
No, they're pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, look at that.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I'm drinking an iced coffee. Do you have like the plastic cups for the iced coffee?
We have a bunch of coffees. Which one are you drinking?
Well, this is Martha's. It's a place nearby.
We did not test that. But let's just search for coffee.
Yeah, I'm specifically curious about iced coffee versus hot coffee.
Well, I think we had one iced coffee. I think we had Nitro Cold Brew from Starbucks.
Interesting.
Which is a very specific cold coffee.
And is that one that came from a Starbucks in a plastic cup, or is that
yes,
okay?
it is.
Because sometimes Starbucks, I think, does these prepackaged things. Okay, right. So that seems pretty high on everything.
It was, so you can't really tell from the absolute number, which is why we have these tooltips. So it looks like this sample is 85th percentile, 82nd, 87th, 93rd. Yeah, relatively high.
Yeah, relatively high. And regular, it looks like, well, it's only one iced coffee, but it seems like, it looks like if you were to look at it, the iced coffee is higher. It's you said 85th percentile, something like that, versus these other ones.
The other ones seem to be a little lower, right? Yeah. Interesting. 72nd. Yeah, which is also counterintuitive, right? We would think that the hotter one would be
potentially with it. But it's also, I think the other question here is that everybody had was kind of what is actually causing this, right? So, for instance, I think that you had one that was really shocking to people, which was Whole Foods grass-fed steak, was it? What was going on there? Because I think most people would assume grass-fed, it's meat, so therefore, you would think that maybe it wouldn't be interacting as much with a process that would cause it to have so much plastic. What was that? And did you look at various aspects of this to try and figure out when was this maybe happening within the supply chain?
Yeah, we tested the Whole Foods steak, but then we also went to a local butcher and we tested the steak that was straight from the butcher. It's the butcher that has their own slaughterhouse. They operate that. It's all very very fresh, straight farm to table. And we found chemicals in both of them. It was surprising for both of the samples. It was surprising. We think it might be, so there are a few streams that could bring in those chemicals. It's possible that it's packaging, the brown paper that these meats are wrapped in. Sometimes there might be something that covers that for preservation or other purposes that might have these chemicals, that it might leach, or it might have been exposed to these chemicals in the production process, whatever that covering layer is. It's also possible that the meat itself already had these chemicals when the animal was actually alive. So if the animal drank water that had these chemicals, or ate, these chemicals are in the soil sometimes. So if the grass, if it's grass-fed and the grass had these chemicals, then the animal would have those chemicals as well. So we don't know where they came from. We have these hypotheses, but that's actually a great thing to do as a follow-on study, because you can just take all of the ingredients and just test them and see what happens. That's one thing we recommend people do, is not just do things sequentially. Like, don't test one thing, wait for the result, and then test the other thing. The hypotheses that you make, at least for us, most of the hypotheses turned out to be wrong. So just take everything you have and just test it. If you're a meat producer, just test the water, the grass, the meat, everything, and then see what happens.
Well, what were some of the ones that turned out to be wrong? Because I'm really curious to hear that. I think that people would be surprised, because I think that a substantial amount of people were very concerned about this around the plastic content, right, in food. Where were your hypotheses sort of off the mark?
They were off the mark in most things. So much so it's easier probably to say where they weren't. But even you and I looked at the microwaves that we were wrong about that. Yeah. The hot versus cold coffee. My intuition was wrong about that. There were a lot of foods that we thought just like there's like no reason for them to have these chemicals, right? There's some baby foods we tested breast milk from a milk bank, and that had these chemicals. So lots of ways in which our intuition was just completely wrong, because it was just based on random kind of guesses. And the one where it seems to hold up is, on average, if you look at the healthier sounding foods like produce, beef, chicken, the levels are smaller and there are fewer chemicals detected in them than for fast food. And
that's likely potentially due to the lack of processing involved.
It's something that has to do with processing would be my guess.
Yeah.
You have, if you look at a burger, like everything there went through some processing step, whereas for maybe a slab of meat, it's less so.
Yeah, or farmer's market.
Or farmer's market berries. Yeah, farmer's market berries is something we tested.
Yeah. Now, I think that something that, when people are looking at this and thinking about this, they're like, wow, I think you said 86% of the things you tested had some notable amount of plastic in them, right? So people would say, does that change anything? Does that make you want to change the way that you're eating or the way you're thinking about food? And I believe Nat tweeted something about, I'm not changing my behavior at all. I'm curious, like, what's the sentiment around the team? What's your reaction to it? Yeah, I'm curious, like how that might change or might not change your behaviors.
Yeah, we had these conversations every once in a while, and probably just sit around the table like, well, what would you change, or how much more would you pay to not have these things? I think there is. We differ in different ways, but the consensus is if you're pregnant or someone you care about is pregnant, then we all would try really, really hard to avoid these things. It seems like there's just terrible effects, or at least the potential of having terrible effects on the fetus. The idea is that that early in life, your hormonal system is very susceptible to even tiniest changes. And you basically have lifelong repercussions if something gets messed up that early on. So you really don't want that to happen. There's studies that show lower IQ, and studies that show that like boys get feminized. And so just things that you really want to avoid. I think we were thinking about the premium that we would pay. And we all thought, 400% easily, we just like pay a lot more in order to avoid that. When it comes to adults and people who are not sensitive to hormonal disruption, it seems like there's not. The idea that we came with into the study was, let's search for a study that's kind of like a smoking gun. We read it and we're convinced. We didn't find a single study that would be that convincing at that level. There are many other studies that show maybe some bad effects or others, but a lot of them are at the levels of the chemicals that are higher than what we eat. And so for a healthy adult, we're actually not changing that much. At least we're withholding our judgment until maybe PlasticList makes more people look into this problem, and then more data comes out.
And there was something you wrote in the report about the difference between the things you were looking at and microplastics. And I think that it's really helpful probably just to say the difference right now. So when somebody's listening or watching, they could actually understand how those things aren't the same.
Yeah, people ask me still all the time about microplastics. Like, that's not what we tested. We tested plastic chemicals. The microplastics are the little tiny pieces of chemicals, the pieces of plastic that get
literal
broken
pieces
off.
Of plastic.
Like literally physical, like you can imagine, maybe you don't see them, but they're there. And and they just break off plastic, and we probably all eat them. There were these papers on microplastics in balls that everyone was resharing. So I think that captures your imagination, right? These pieces of plastic. We tested for plastic chemicals.
Yeah.
Chemicals are, you see a lot of them are liquids. You can read the tooltips. They are added to plastics to give them some properties, like, for example, make it flexible. And so they're not embedded in the molecular structure, right? They can leach, they can basically break off relatively easily after the food, when there's contact with the food or something else, and they can leach. And there's just much more evidence that we found that showed harm from plastic chemicals as opposed to microplastics. It seemed more like the graph up and to the right that I told you about, that was for plastic chemicals.
And when you're talking about these kind of areas of concern around this, you say it's especially important for people who are maybe developing kids and things like that, or people who are pregnant or maybe soon to be pregnant. What were the things in these studies that you were seeing that were concerning? I read a bunch of it. I'm not going to try and read it off of here. I'll just have you sort of speak a little bit to it. What were some of the areas that were causes of concern, attributes, things that cause people to say, oh wow, that would be really bad if that were to happen, or there might be some relationship between these chemicals, these plastic chemicals, many of which are liquids, not microplastics, that could actually have negative sort of outcomes for these more vulnerable populations.
The studies that we found the most convincing were they would basically test the amount of these chemicals in the mother's organism during pregnancy. So they would test something like urine, usually is a good way to measure the amount of chemicals. And then they would track some health endpoints throughout the newborn's life or the first 2 years of their life. And there's one study that looked at the Wechsler IQ scores. So they basically tracked the amount of several phthalates in the mother's urine, and then after the kids were born, they would wait for a few years and they would test their IQ scores. They controlled for the confounders that you might think of, such as social economic status. I think they controlled for age, for other things, for habits, and they found that kids whose mothers had higher exposure to phthalates had, I think, up to 7-point lower IQs. And that was a study that I found concerning.
Yeah, for sure.
The other study that is pretty widely cited is a 2005 study that, I think it was 2005, that looked at this metric that they call AGD, which is the anal genital distance. You can probably imagine what that is, but basically that's a measure of so boys and girls have very different AGDs. Boys have a larger one, and so they would measure that to see how much the hormonal changes that they thought might be happening would affect the boys. And then they found that the higher concentration of these chemicals in the mothers would lead to essentially lower AGD. So AGD would shrink in those boys. The boys would be born with smaller AGDs, effectively being feminized from what they claim is potentially these chemicals.
And they were doing this study, and this was in lab rats. They were mostly looking at.
Those were humans.
Those were humans.
Yeah, because they weren't giving the chemicals to the people. They were just already observing what
was happening.
Yeah. You can't give chemicals.
And it was a pretty substantial.
Yeah, I think they had they measured it in odds ratios. We actually have it in the report.
That'd be great.
I'll pull it up for you. So it was a study by Shanna Swan. They looked at 85 boys, and they measured AGD as the main one. And like I said, it's a measure of sexual differentiation, essentially. And then they showed a dose-response relationship, which just means that larger dose has a higher effect, a smaller dose has a smaller effect. And they compared the AGD or AGI relative to whatever they expected was for the boys. And in the highest quartile, so whenever a baby was exposed to a lot of these chemicals, they found that there was an odds ratio of 10 that those babies would have shorter than expected AGI. And odds ratio essentially just means you're more likely to have that.
This seems like it could be incredibly important for, kids, for people who are pregnant, for women who are pregnant. Maybe we should pivot from this discussion, because I think that there's a lot for people to read up on the report, to talking about sort of the reaction to the report, because you released it, less than a week ago at this point, or about a week ago?
6 days.
6 days ago. So what was the reaction from sort of the general public? And then let's talk about the reaction from people who are actually making these foods.
It seems like the people are interested in this. The design of the website seems to be recognizable, which is something I personally didn't think about up front. I just wanted to make a really cool website a really cool design for the website.
It's visually arresting when you see
Right.
when you see those yellows.
Yeah. And so people have been resharing that, and it seems to have become something that people recognize from the design. There were a bunch of companies reached out to us, and they every single one of them was just genuinely interested in figuring out where that contamination happens, and then changing maybe the suppliers or changing the process to get rid of that. So something I wanted to do with the report, all of us wanted to do, was to make sure we're presenting the actual evidence that we think is true, and then are being humble intellectually and saying, well, we're not experts, we just read a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Here's what we think, here's what it seems. It's all out there. If you disagree with something, you have very concrete things you can disagree with, and you can just tell us about that, and maybe you'll be right. And so far, everyone seems to be interested in this, wanting to learn more. Some people want to run follow-on studies. Companies want to figure out where it's coming from. That's been largely the response so far.
What would you hope people take away from the meta sort of project here? Like the fact that you worked on this, the fact that you all came together. I don't think that any of you really knew each other prior to working on this. What do you want people to take away from that? And then what do you want people to take away from this project in particular, PlasticList?
You can just do things. Huh. That's the biggest truth that I think the world runs on, is you can just follow your curiosity. You can take something that seems interesting, and then you can just work really, really hard. And if you run into challenges, you can find ways to solve them and just keep going. And what you will have at the end is something that most of the times you didn't think was possible. And it's just going to work, it's going to be great, and you should do more of that. We want more people to do more of that, and you can take up one of the studies that we have on as follow-on studies, or you can do something completely different. It's there's really not much to it other than just deciding to actually follow your curiosity and do it.
It's really cool. What maybe one last sort of closing question for you here. What's next for you? How are you thinking about what you want to do next? I think you said to me before we hit record, that this is sort of a one and done thing. This isn't some sort of ongoing thing. The hope for PlasticList is to create this sort of document of a moment in time, create this data set, and then give that as a way for people to jump off and do their own things with it. But what's your own thing? What do you think you might want to do next? Yeah,
the very first thing I'll do is I have this coat hanger that's been on the floor in my hallway in the apartment. I'm gonna hang it on the wall. Okay. It's been up there. It's been down there for too long, and I haven't had the time because I was working on PlasticList. It's gonna be my first goal, and once I do that, I'll feel really good. And then I think I'll just I'll take a little bit of time to think about what to work on next, and once I figure that out, I'll just go all in and be working on the next thing and be making something, building something.
Well, I think people will be looking forward to what happens after the coat hanger.
Right. Yeah.
Was there anything actually that you wanted to talk about, like that we didn't touch on?
Well, just the one takeaway I also had from this project was how the people that helped us were just absolutely wonderful and terrific. The analytical chemist that was advising us, we just send them all these labs, and he just talked to them and vet them. Or he also went and validated all the data that we have on the website, which is hours and hours of work. And there's a lot of just amazing people that we met along the way that we didn't know before that were willing to help us. And that's another thing that just happens when you work on things. At least tends to happen. And it was very inspiring to be working on that alongside those people.
I think one of the other cool maybe takeaways from that is when you work on something that's interesting and that people want to see happen, you can be sometimes surprised or at least excited by the amount of people who will, take time, lend their expertise, lend resources towards this. And I think that that's
Absolutely.
such a cool thing because it sometimes can feel like maybe at the start of something like you're going to be going at it alone. But the reality is if you're doing something that resonates with people, you start to have all these people who are going to help and contribute in different ways.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I think this is going to be a great document, and we can't wait to see what happens next.
Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Multitudes. The goal for this show is to highlight ideas and people worth exploring further. If you'd like to go deeper on the ideas discussed today, you can check out the transcript and much more at multitudes.weiser.io. If you enjoyed what you listened to, I'd appreciate you leaving a review or a thumbs up, and of course, subscribing for future episodes.